The most dangerous moment in a contract marriage is not the day you sign the agreement. It is the day you realize you would do anything to stop the other person from leaving. The grand foyer of the Hayes estate felt unusually quiet as Naomi Brooks slowly pulled a navy suitcase across the polished marble floor. Morning sunlight streamed through the towering windows, painting long golden reflections across the empty room. 1 year earlier, she had entered this house as a stranger with a signed contract in her hand. Today, she was leaving with nothing except her dignity, her memories, and a heart that felt heavier than she wanted to admit. Naomi paused near the front door and looked around one last time. The estate had never truly felt like hers. The elegant staircase, the crystal chandeliers, the carefully arranged artwork worth more than most houses in America had always belonged to another world. Yet somehow, over the past 12 months, pieces of her life had quietly settled into these rooms. The books she left on side tables, the flowers she placed in the kitchen every Sunday morning, the laughter that occasionally echoed through hallways that had once been silent. She took a slow breath and tightened her grip on the suitcase handle. The contract was ending exactly as agreed. No arguments, no broken promises, no surprises. That was how it was supposed to be. Upstairs, Alexander Hayes stood motionless inside his home office, staring through the window at the gardens below. At 36, he had built one of the most successful corporations in the country. Newspapers described him as brilliant. Investors called him visionary. Competitors feared him. Yet none of those accomplishments prepared him for the strange ache growing inside his chest as he watched Naomi prepare to leave. He glanced toward the folder resting on his desk. Inside was the original agreement they had signed exactly 1 year ago. The terms had seemed simple then. A temporary marriage that would satisfy family expectations and protect important business negotiations. Professional, efficient, emotionless. Alexander almost laughed at how confident he had been. Nothing about the last year had remained emotionless. He remembered the first time Naomi had walked into the mansion carrying only 2 suitcases and a warm smile. She had thanked every employee by name. She had baked cookies for the security staff during Christmas. She had somehow transformed a house into something that felt dangerously close to a home. And now she was leaving. A knock interrupted his thoughts. His assistant entered quietly. "Sir, the legal documents are ready." Alexander looked at the papers waiting for his signature. One signature. One final formality. One ending. "Thank you," he said. The assistant hesitated before leaving. Even she seemed aware that something unusual hung in the air. Downstairs, Naomi adjusted the strap of her handbag and reached for the door. Her heart urged her to leave quickly before emotions complicated everything. She had promised herself she would not cry. This marriage had never been real. At least that was what she kept telling herself. Yet as her hand touched the door handle, a voice echoed from the staircase behind her. "Naomi." She froze instantly. Slowly, she turned. Alexander stood at the top of the staircase, sunlight framing his silhouette. For several seconds, neither moved. Neither spoke. The silence carried the weight of an entire year. And for the first time since signing the contract, Alexander Hayes looked genuinely afraid. Alexander slowly descended the staircase, each step echoing through the silent mansion. Naomi remained near the front door, her suitcase beside her, her fingers still resting on the brass handle. Neither seemed certain what should happen next. Outside, a fountain sparkled beneath the morning sun while a gentle breeze stirred the gardens. Everything looked peaceful. Yet inside the house, emotions neither of them had planned for were quietly demanding attention. Alexander stopped a few feet away from her. For an instant, he looked nothing like the confident executive who commanded boardrooms filled with powerful investors. He looked like a man searching desperately for the right words and finding none. Naomi forced a small smile. "The documents are ready, right?" The question sounded calm, but she hated how fragile it felt. Alexander glanced toward the office hallway where the final papers waited. "Yes." The answer lingered between them. Naomi nodded. Then everything worked out exactly as planned. He looked at her for a long moment. Did it? She was not prepared for that question. A year ago, everything had been simple. Her mother had been facing financial hardship. Alexander needed a temporary wife to satisfy conditions tied to a complicated family trust and several important business arrangements. The agreement had been clear from the beginning. 12 months. Shared public appearances. Mutual respect. No expectations beyond the contract. Naomi remembered sitting across from him in a Manhattan law office, staring at pages filled with legal language. She had expected a cold businessman. Instead, she found a man who barely looked up from the documents as he explained the terms with professional efficiency. She had signed because it felt practical, temporary, safe. Neither of them could have imagined how much life would change afterward. Alexander remembered that meeting too. He remembered noticing how calm she seemed despite the intimidating surroundings. Most people reacted to wealth with excitement or nervousness. Naomi had reacted with quiet dignity. Even then, she had been different. "Do you remember our first meeting?" he asked unexpectedly. Naomi laughed softly. "You were 20 minutes late." For the first time that morning, a faint smile appeared on his face. "My assistant still reminds me about that. You never apologized." "I know. I noticed." The exchange was simple, but it carried the warmth of 100 conversations accumulated over 12 months. The silence that followed felt less uncomfortable than before. It felt familiar. Naomi lowered her eyes toward the wedding ring still resting on her finger. The ring had begun as part of a legal arrangement. Somewhere along the way, it had become harder to separate symbolism from reality. "Alexander," she said quietly, "we knew this day would come." He nodded. "I know." Yet neither moved toward the paperwork waiting upstairs. Neither mentioned signatures or legal obligations. Instead, memories seemed to fill the room. Sunday breakfasts in the kitchen, charity events, late evening conversations beside the fireplace. The way Naomi always left fresh flowers on the dining table. The way Alexander secretly rearranged meetings to make it home for dinner. Small moments, meaningless on their own, life-changing together. Finally, Naomi picked up her suitcase. The movement sent an unexpected wave of panic through Alexander. He had negotiated billion-dollar deals without hesitation. Yet watching her prepare to leave felt unbearable. "Naomi," he said again. This time his voice was lower, more vulnerable. She looked up. The sunlight caught the tears she was trying not to shed. Alexander took a slow breath. For months he had ignored the truth growing inside him. For months he had convinced himself there would always be more time. Standing there now, with her hand wrapped around the suitcase handle and the future slipping away 1 second at a time, he realized time had finally run out. Naomi stood perfectly still, her suitcase beside her, while the silence between them seemed to stretch across the entire mansion. The morning sun continued pouring through the windows, illuminating dust particles that drifted lazily through the air. Everything appeared calm, yet her heart was anything but. Alexander rarely hesitated. He was known for making decisions quickly, confidently, and without emotion. That was one of the reasons his company had become so successful. Yet now he looked as though he was fighting a battle no one else could see. Naomi lowered her gaze. Part of her wanted him to say something. Another part feared exactly what he might say. Before either could speak again, her mind drifted backward to the beginning of it all. 1 year earlier, she had entered a conference room overlooking downtown Manhattan. Rain streaked the glass walls while attorneys organized documents across a polished table. She remembered feeling intimidated by the environment, but determined not to show it. Medical bills connected to her mother's treatment had placed enormous pressure on her family. When the opportunity for a temporary arrangement appeared, she had viewed it as a practical solution to an impossible situation. Then Alexander Hayes walked into the room. He had been dressed in a charcoal suit, carrying a tablet and several folders. No smile, no small talk, just business. He greeted everyone professionally before sitting across from her. Naomi remembered expecting arrogance. Instead, she found distance. The kind of distance created by someone who had spent years protecting himself from disappointment. He explained the agreement carefully. A 1-year marriage. Public appearances when necessary. Complete respect for personal boundaries. Financial support that would allow her family stability. When he finished speaking, he asked a simple question. "Do you feel pressured to accept this?" She remembered being surprised. "No," he nodded once. "Good. If you agree, it should be because it is your choice." Looking back, that moment mattered more than she realized. Even then, he treated her with dignity. The memory faded as she returned to the present. Alexander was still watching her. "You have been quiet," he said. Naomi offered a faint smile. "I was remembering the day we met." A shadow of amusement crossed his face. "You looked terrified." "I was." "You hid it well." For the first time that morning, both laughed softly. The sound echoed gently through the foyer. Then the laughter faded, leaving behind something more complicated. Do you regret it? Alexander asked quietly. Naomi understood immediately what he meant. Not the contract, not the arrangement, the entire year, the dinners, the conversations, the memories. She thought carefully before answering. No, the word came easily because it was true. I do not regret any of it. Relief flashed briefly across his expression. It disappeared almost immediately, but she noticed. Over the past year, she had become surprisingly skilled at reading emotions he rarely revealed to anyone else. The grandfather clock near the staircase chimed softly. Time continued moving forward whether they were ready or not. Naomi looked toward the front door. Beyond it waited a future she had been preparing for during months of quiet determination. Yet suddenly it did not feel as certain as before. Alexander followed her gaze. Then he looked back at her wedding ring. His eyes lingered there longer than expected. Finally, he took a slow breath. Whatever he had been avoiding for months appeared to reach a breaking point. Because for the first time since this arrangement began, Alexander Hayes seemed ready to stop acting like a man bound by a contract and start speaking like a man following his heart. Alexander lowered his eyes briefly before looking back at Naomi. The sunlight spilling across the marble floor seemed brighter now, as though the house itself was waiting for whatever came next. For an entire year, he had hidden behind schedules, business meetings, and carefully controlled routines. Feelings were inconvenient. Emotions complicated decisions. That philosophy had served him well in business. It was failing him completely now. Naomi watched him quietly. She had seen him negotiate with powerful executives without hesitation. She had seen him remain calm during corporate crises that made headlines across the country. Yet the man standing in front of her looked uncertain for the first time since she had met him. "What are you thinking?" she asked softly. Alexander released a slow breath. "I am thinking about how none of this happened the way I expected." A faint smile touched Naomi's lips. "That makes two of us." His gaze drifted toward the dining room visible beyond the foyer. "When you moved in, I thought you would stay out of my way." Naomi laughed. "You practically asked me to." "I did. You even gave me a list of household guidelines." Alexander shook his head with embarrassment. "Please do not remind me." Rule number 3 was especially memorable. "Which one?" "No unnecessary conversations before 8 o'clock in the morning." To his surprise, he laughed. A real laugh. The kind he had not experienced often before Naomi entered his life. The memory brought dozens of others with it. Sunday breakfasts that started with accidental conversations and lasted 2 hours. Evenings spent discussing books beside the fireplace. Charity events where Naomi somehow knew every employee's name while he barely remembered half of them. Little by little, she had changed the atmosphere of his world without ever trying. "You broke every one of those rules," he said. "I know. You never seemed concerned about it." Naomi smiled warmly. "You looked like someone who needed the rules broken." The statement landed harder than she intended, because it was true. Before Naomi, the mansion had been quiet, efficient, perfectly organized. It had also been lonely. Alexander turned toward the enormous windows overlooking the gardens. Roses bloomed beside stone pathways Naomi had helped redesign during the spring. Even the flowers felt connected to her now. Everywhere he looked, he found evidence of the life she had brought into the house. "Do you know something strange?" he asked. Naomi waited. "I cannot remember what this place felt like before you arrived." The confession hung between them. Her eyes softened immediately. Neither spoke for several moments. Outside, birds moved through the gardens while sunlight danced across the fountain. The peaceful scene felt almost unreal compared to the emotions building inside the foyer. Naomi tightened her grip on the suitcase handle. "Alexander, eventually memories are all people have." He looked directly at her. "What if I do not want memories?" Her heartbeat quickened. The question carried more meaning than either of them could ignore. For months, they had danced around truths neither seemed brave enough to acknowledge. Now those truths stood directly between them. The distance separating them suddenly felt far smaller than before. Alexander took a step forward. Then another. His voice dropped lower, carrying a sincerity Naomi had rarely heard. "What if I am not ready for you to leave?" The words settled into the silence like a stone dropped into still water, creating ripples neither of them could stop. Naomi's breath caught as Alexander's words settled between them. For a moment, neither moved. The grand foyer seemed suspended outside of time, while sunlight continued spilling across the marble floor. She had imagined many versions of this morning during the past few weeks. In every version, she quietly left the mansion, thanked him for everything, and walked away with her dignity intact. She had never imagined Alexander Hayes asking her to stay. The man standing before her looked nothing like the distant executive she met a year earlier. There was uncertainty in his eyes now, vulnerability, honesty. Naomi lowered her gaze toward the suitcase beside her. Leaving had seemed so simple when it was only an idea. Standing here now, it suddenly felt impossible. Alexander, she said carefully, the contract is over. He nodded. I know. We both agreed to that. I know that too. His voice remained calm, but there was something deeper beneath it. Something she had never heard before. He took another step closer. The problem is that somewhere along the way, this stopped feeling like a contract to me. Naomi's heart tightened. She looked away, afraid he might see too much emotion in her eyes. Across the foyer, a vase of fresh white roses sat on a side table. She had placed them there 3 days earlier. Small details like that existed throughout the house. Little traces of her presence. Without realizing it, she had woven herself into the fabric of his daily life. The realization frightened her because the same thing had happened to her. Alexander had become part of her routines, her thoughts, her future. Do you remember the charity dinner in Chicago? He asked suddenly. Naomi smiled despite herself. The one where your speech was delayed because you spent 20 minutes helping the kitchen staff move supplies. You were supposed to stay in the ballroom. I got bored. He laughed softly. That was the first time I realized you were impossible. The warmth in his voice brought back the memory clearly. They had returned to the hotel after midnight, exhausted and laughing over something neither could remember now. It had been one of dozens of moments that felt insignificant at the time and precious afterward. You changed things, Alexander admitted quietly. I never intended for that to happen. Naomi looked at him again. Neither did I. The honesty surprised both of them. For months, they had hidden behind politeness and practicality. Now there seemed little point. The truth was already standing between them. Alexander glanced toward the staircase. Before you moved in, this house was just a place where I slept between meetings. His eyes returned to hers. You made it feel alive. Naomi felt tears threaten again. Not because of sadness, because every word sounded sincere. You gave me a home when my family needed help, she replied. You treated my mother with kindness. You respected me from the beginning. Alexander shook his head slowly. Respect was easy. The silence that followed carried a different meaning now. A deeper one. Naomi understood it immediately. Respect had never been the difficult part. Somewhere during late-night conversations, shared breakfasts, and ordinary moments, something much stronger had taken root. Outside, the fountain continued sparkling beneath the morning sun. Inside, two people stood at the edge of a choice neither had expected to face. Then Naomi noticed something unusual. For the first time since she met him, Alexander seemed completely unconcerned about business schedules, legal agreements, or consequences. The only thing that mattered was the possibility of losing her. And for the first time, she began to wonder whether walking out that front door would be the greatest mistake either of them could make. Naomi looked at the front door, then back at Alexander. The choice that had once seemed obvious now felt impossibly complicated. For months, she had prepared herself for this goodbye. She had repeated the same reminder every day. The marriage was temporary. The agreement had an ending. Feelings could not change facts. Yet standing in the foyer, she realized facts were no longer the problem. The problem was everything that had happened between the lines of the contract. Alexander studied her expression carefully. He had spent years reading financial reports and market trends, but nothing felt more important than understanding what she was thinking in this moment. The possibility that she might still leave tightened something deep inside him. I never expected this, he admitted quietly. Naomi gave a small laugh. You keep saying that. Because it is true. He glanced toward the enormous windows where sunlight illuminated the gardens. When this started, I thought I was solving a business problem. And now, he met her eyes. Now I cannot imagine my life without you in it. The honesty of the statement seemed to echo through the room. Naomi felt her heart race. For an entire year, she had protected herself from hoping for something more. Alexander had always been respectful, thoughtful, and kind in ways few people ever saw. But he had also been careful, reserved. She never allowed herself to believe his feelings might eventually mirror her own. Do you know what scared me the most? She asked softly. He shook his head. The fact that I stopped counting the days. His expression shifted immediately. Naomi smiled sadly. At the beginning, I knew exactly how many months remained. Then one day I realized I had stopped keeping track. Memories flooded her mind. Decorating the mansion for Christmas together. Watching movies during rainstorms. Cooking dinner on evenings when both of them were exhausted. Ordinary moments that somehow became extraordinary. I told myself not to get attached, she continued. I failed. Alexander closed his eyes briefly as relief and emotion washed over him. For the first time that morning, hope entered the room. Small, fragile, but unmistakably present. Naomi, he said, taking another step closer. There is something I should have told you a long time ago. She waited. His voice remained steady, but she could hear the emotion beneath it. About 6 months ago, my attorney asked if I wanted to prepare an extension. Naomi blinked in surprise. An extension? He nodded. A legal option that would have allowed us to continue the arrangement if both parties agreed. You never mentioned it. Because by then, I no longer wanted an arrangement. The words settled gently between them. Outside, the fountain continued its quiet rhythm. Somewhere in the distance, birds moved through the gardens. Everything felt strangely peaceful. What did you want? Naomi asked. Alexander smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes. I wanted breakfast conversations that lasted too long. I wanted Sunday mornings in the kitchen. I wanted to hear you remind the staff to take lunch breaks. I wanted every ordinary moment that somehow became the best part of my day. Naomi felt tears gathering again. Not from sadness. From the overwhelming realization that she was not alone in what she felt. For an entire year, two people had been falling in love while pretending they were simply honoring a contract. The suitcase beside her suddenly seemed less important than before. The legal documents waiting upstairs felt distant. For the first time all morning, neither of them was thinking about an ending. Because standing there in the sunlight, looking at one another without walls or excuses, they were finally beginning to understand that the story they feared was over might actually be ready to begin. For several seconds, neither Naomi nor Alexander spoke. The mansion that had once felt impossibly large now seemed to shrink around them, leaving only the truth that had been growing between them for months. Naomi glanced down at the suitcase beside her and suddenly realized how strange it looked there. It represented a future she had carefully planned, yet that future no longer felt certain. Alexander noticed the change in her expression. Hope flickered inside him, cautious but real. He had spent an entire year hiding behind logic. Now logic had nothing left to say. I should have told you sooner, he admitted. Every month, I found another reason to wait. Naomi smiled softly. You are not very good at talking about feelings. That may be the understatement of the century. The shared laugh eased some of the tension between them. Sunlight continued spilling through the tall windows, warming the marble floor beneath their feet. For the first time that morning, the mansion no longer felt like a place where something was ending. It felt like a place waiting for a decision. Naomi slowly released the suitcase handle. The simple movement did not go unnoticed. Alexander's gaze followed it immediately. When did it happen? She asked quietly. He understood exactly what she meant. He thought for a moment. I am not sure. His eyes drifted toward the kitchen hallway. Maybe the morning I found you teaching the chef how to make your mother's peach cobbler recipe. Naomi laughed. That recipe almost started a disaster. It became the chef's favorite dessert. He smiled. Or maybe it happened when you spent an entire weekend organizing a fundraiser for the children's literacy program. Naomi folded her arms gently. That was important. Everything was important to you. The sincerity in his voice made her heart ache. Alexander took another step closer. The truth is, I stopped noticing the exact moment because there were too many moments. Naomi lowered her eyes briefly. She understood. Her own feelings had not arrived all at once either. They had appeared quietly during ordinary days. The way he remembered details about her family. The way he always made time for her mother during medical appointments. The way he listened when she spoke, even after exhausting business trips. Small acts that revealed a kindness few people ever saw. I think I know when it happened for me, she admitted. Alexander looked surprised. You do? Naomi nodded. 3 months after I moved in. He waited. My mother called late one night because she was worried about a medical test. Her voice softened with the memory. I came downstairs because I could not sleep. Alexander remembered immediately. You were sitting by the fireplace. Yes. She smiled. You sat there with me until sunrise, even though you had an important meeting the next morning. Alexander shrugged lightly. You needed someone. That was the problem. He looked confused. Naomi met his eyes. I realized I had started needing you. Silence followed. Not an uncomfortable silence. A meaningful one. The kind created when two people finally stop hiding from the truth. Somewhere upstairs, the grandfather clock marked another passing minute. Time continued moving forward, but neither seemed interested in leaving this moment behind. Then Naomi reached up and gently touched the wedding ring on her finger. For months, she had viewed it as a symbol of an agreement. Now it felt like something else entirely. Alexander watched her carefully, his heart pounding harder than any boardroom presentation had ever made it pound. Because for the first time since this extraordinary arrangement began, he believed there was a chance she might not walk out the front door after all. Naomi's fingers remained lightly wrapped around the wedding ring as she stood facing Alexander. The morning sunlight had shifted higher now, casting warm patterns across the foyer floor. Neither seemed aware of time passing. For the first time since the arrangement began, there were no legal terms left to hide behind, no convenient excuses, and no carefully constructed walls. There was only the truth. Alexander looked at her with a sincerity she had never seen before. I spent months trying to convince myself that what I felt was gratitude, he admitted. Then I told myself it was friendship. Then respect. Naomi smiled softly. And did any of those explanations work? He shook his head. Not even a little. A quiet laugh escaped her before emotion returned to her eyes. For so long she had imagined this conversation and immediately dismissed it as impossible. Alexander Hayes was known for certainty. Yet standing here now, he looked like a man willing to risk everything on honesty. You know what is strange? Naomi asked. What? I always thought you were fearless. Alexander actually smiled at that. You have clearly never seen me this morning. The answer carried enough vulnerability to make her heart ache. He took another step closer, reducing the distance between them. Naomi, I negotiate billion-dollar agreements for a living. None of those conversations have ever been as difficult as this one. She lowered her gaze briefly. Why? His answer came without hesitation. Because none of those outcomes mattered as much. The words settled into the silence. Outside, the fountain continued its steady rhythm. Somewhere deeper inside the mansion, staff moved quietly through their routines, unaware that the future of the household was being decided only a few feet away. Naomi thought about the past year. The contract had solved practical problems, but it had also given her something unexpected. Stability, friendship, belonging. She had walked into the estate believing she was entering a temporary arrangement. Instead, she had found a place where she felt seen and valued. More importantly, she had found someone who quietly became the center of her days. I was afraid, she admitted. Alexander listened carefully. Of what? Of wanting something that was never supposed to be real. His expression softened immediately. It was real for me. Naomi felt tears gathering again. Not because she was sad, but because hearing those words healed something she had been carrying for months. When I packed my suitcase last night, she continued, I kept stopping. Why? She smiled through the emotion. Because every room reminded me of you. For a moment, Alexander simply closed his eyes. Relief moved across his face so visibly that Naomi almost laughed. It was as if he had been holding his breath for weeks and was finally allowed to breathe again. When he opened his eyes, the uncertainty remained, but hope stood beside it now. Then maybe we have both been making the same mistake, he said quietly. What mistake? Assuming this story was ending. Naomi looked around the mansion that had become so important to both of them. The staircase, the windows, the dining room where countless conversations had unfolded. Nothing about the place felt temporary anymore. Her gaze returned to the suitcase beside her. Slowly, deliberately, she released the handle and stepped away from it. Alexander noticed immediately. Neither spoke. Words were unnecessary, because in that simple movement, she had revealed more than any speech ever could. And for the first time since the morning began, a genuine smile appeared on Alexander Hayes's face, the kind that came not from success or achievement, but from the possibility that the woman he loved might choose to stay. 1 year later, the Hayes estate looked different. Not because the architecture had changed or because new artwork decorated the walls. It felt different because it was filled with life. Morning sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows while the scent of fresh coffee and warm pastries drifted through the house. Laughter echoed from the dining room. Conversations interrupted quiet routines. What had once been an impressive mansion had become a home. Naomi stood near the kitchen island, arranging flowers into a glass vase. It had become a Sunday tradition. Across the room, Alexander was attempting to help prepare breakfast, although the chef had long ago concluded that his talents were better suited to boardrooms than kitchens. The sight made Naomi smile. A year earlier, she had almost walked away from all of this. Sometimes she still thought about that morning. The suitcase, the front door, the contract that was supposed to end everything. Instead, it became the beginning. Alexander looked up from his latest unsuccessful attempt at cooking and caught her smiling. "I know that look." Naomi laughed softly. "Do you? You are remembering." She nodded. Neither needed to explain further. Some memories remained powerful because of how close they came to changing everything. After that morning, the legal documents upstairs were never signed. The contract quietly expired on its own. Several months later, Alexander proposed during a charity event supporting literacy programs for children. There had been no grand spectacle, no reporters, no audience, just honesty. The same honesty that finally brought them together. Naomi glanced at the wedding ring resting comfortably on her finger. This ring was different from the one connected to the agreement. This one represented a choice, a promise freely given and freely accepted. The sound of a doorbell echoed through the house. Moments later, family and friends began arriving for a gathering in the garden. Naomi's mother entered first, healthier and stronger than she had been in years. Alexander greeted her warmly before carrying extra chairs outside. Watching them together still touched Naomi's heart. The garden had become one of their favorite places. Roses lined the pathways. The fountain sparkled beneath the afternoon sun. Guests filled the space with laughter and conversation. As the celebration continued, one of Alexander's longtime business associates approached Naomi. He glanced around the estate with admiration. "I have known Alexander for 15 years, he said. "I have never seen him this happy." Naomi followed his gaze. Across the lawn, Alexander was helping several children build paper airplanes while laughing harder than anyone else. The associate smiled knowingly. "You changed his life." Naomi considered the statement carefully. Then she shook her head. "We changed each other's." As evening approached, golden light settled across the gardens. Music drifted softly through the air. Family members gathered for photographs near the fountain. Someone called for Alexander and Naomi to stand together. They moved into position while cameras prepared to capture the moment. For an instant, Naomi remembered the frightened young woman who had signed a temporary agreement believing she was solving a financial problem. She wished she could tell that younger version of herself something important. Sometimes the plans that fail become blessings. Sometimes unexpected paths lead exactly where they are supposed to lead. Alexander slipped his hand into hers. The gesture was natural now, effortless. He smiled down at her before looking toward the camera. The shutter clicked. One photograph. Two people. A lifetime ahead of them. And as the last light of day painted the gardens gold, both understood the same simple truth. The greatest thing either of them gained from that contract was never security, convenience, or obligation. It was finding the person who finally made every ordinary day feel extraordinary.